Thank you very much. Further debate, the member for Timmins-James Bay.
Right from the activist centre to the left of the centre line is the NDP. I've got to say I agree with most of what, pretty well everything that my colleague, the House Leader for the Conservative Party, has raised, because I think that the government tried to build an expectation when they came in with their majority government that they really wanted to work with the opposition and find a way for us to be able to move forward an agenda that allowed them to get their agenda, allowed them to pass their bills, and gave the opposition an opportunity to give some scrutiny to the legislation. And I think, you know, that is not a bad idea. When I first got here in 1990, there was no such thing as Standing Order 47. The only way you can stop debate is by calling the question. And there wasn't even a limit to how much you can speak in this House. I remember various members, the member from St. Catharines, my God, how he would take the floor and go on for a day or two about absolutely anything he wanted to talk about. But that was his right as a member, and yeah, it was kind of hard to take at times. And I was known once or twice in that first Parliament, having done so myself because of decisions that were made by our whip at the time. But the point was, even in a majority Parliament, what's making that noise is what's driving me crazy here. It's as if it's picking up something every time I hit the desk. When I first got here in 1990, even in a majority Parliament, the government just couldn't do what it wanted. It had to work with the opposition parties to be able to move its agenda forward. And this is how it worked. And it was, I think, a fairly good system. The government would decide what it wanted as a bill. Let's say it was the fall. They would introduce the bill at first reading in the fall. They would conclude second reading sometime in the fall when it came to the actual bill. Sometimes the bills had very little debate because it would be an agreement amongst the House leaders to give it some time in committee. But here is the kicker. Normally, we didn't do the hearings in the session that the bill was introduced. We did it in the intersession. And it allowed the committees to go out on the road and to actually talk to the public about the bill. And you know what? That worked for the government, and it also worked for the opposition. And I'll give you an example of one bill, just as an example, and that was the changes, the creation of the Sustainable Forestry Development Act that was done under our government by Howard Hampton when he was Minister of Natural Resources. And I think it was introduced in the fall, because I kind of remember having the hearings in the winter, but I might be wrong. Maybe I've got the timing wrong. But it was introduced. We had a fairly short debate at second reading. The bill went out for hearings, and it traveled Northern Ontario. Why? It was about sustainable forestry development. So we went to places around the province that were affected by forestry. And I always remember there was a newly elected member who came in a by-election when Mr. Dennis Drainville left, and that was Chris Hodgson, who would become the member to go on that committee. And Chris, I'm going to use his name because he's no longer a member in this place, so I can call him Chris. He's actually a good friend. He's now president of the Ontario Mining Association. Went out as an eager Beaver member. I always remember that because I was an eager Beaver member too. As you, Mr. Arnott, of the class of 1990, the few of us that are left, went out and heard what people had to say about the bill. Yeah, he was being oppositional to our bill. There was no question about that, as was his right. But he was also trying to find ways to make the bill more functional. And so while we were in places like Sioux Lookout and Thunder Bay and Kapuskasing and the various places that we went to, he would reach out to people to come and talk to the committee about the bill. They would make suggestions from both the forest industry, the First Nations, communities and others about what they thought was the problems with the bill. And guess what happened? After 2 or 3 weeks of hearings, and I don't remember how long we were gone, but it seems to me that one had may have had up to 4 weeks of hearings if I remember that one. God, we got to be friends on that committee. Imagine that. Members of this assembly actually got along. Conservative, New Democrat, Liberals. We called each other by our first name. We established friendships and relationships that last till today. I still consider Chris a friend from the experience I had in 1990, whatever it was. Why? Because those committees not only serve the function of giving the public a chance to have a hearing on the bill in question, it allowed members to work together. Because the House leaders had to work out ahead of time how much time the bill was going to have in committee, and the government House leader had to satisfy the opposition that the time was sufficient enough to be able to satisfy his critics and his caucus about how long that bill would be out on the road. And guess what else happened? We actually amended legislation. Can you imagine that, Steve? Oh, I can't use Steve. The member for Leeds Grenville, the House Leader of the Conservative Party. Can you imagine? We actually went into clause by clause after all these hearings, and there would be amendments that were brought forward by the opposition, and God Almighty, they passed. We'd actually take those amendments and we incorporate them into the bill. I'm not saying for a second we took them all, absolutely not. But there were a number of amendments that were accepted because members of the committee dropped their partisanship somewhat when they were on the road, because they now felt somewhat empowered to be able to make a change to the bill that they felt that they were doing their jobs and they were being useful. And the public felt engaged because, hey, you know, I've talked to the Conservative member or the NDP member or the Liberal member, and they tell me they're going to bat for us, and everybody felt as if the process was somewhat theirs. And we actually passed legislation that was changed quite a bit from second reading to the time we brought it back for third. You know, and that was because of the committee process. So this government comes in and says, oh, we're going to have to time allocate everything because it's so important. Oh my God, the world's going to end. It's going to come to an end if we don't pass this legislation. Well, you know, it never took less than a year to pass legislation in this place when I first got here. The legislature operated for, at that point, 100 years. I think the anniversary of the legislature was about the time that I was elected, so about 100 years. So for 100 years, this place operated with no time allocation. It operated with a sometimes very acrimonious debates at second reading, sometimes quite partisan campaigns in the time that we weren't in committee. But the thing that they had to do, they did have to work together, because the government did not have a time allocation rule. The only way that we can allow a bill to go quickly through the House or without too much interference from the opposition, as we would see it as a government interference, it'd be the same for the Tories or the Liberals, was we had to go and make a deal with the opposition. It was virtually a minority parliament when you really stop and think about it. And here's, I'm going to give a little bit, this is maybe unfair, because this is my view, and if somebody feels different, I would suggest get in the debate and explain to me why. But one of the problems that we had in the last minority parliament, people had forgotten how to work together. That was the big failure of the beginning, the very beginning of the minority parliament of the last session, is that because governments have done time allocation since 1993 or 4 under the NDP, accelerated under the Tories, and concluded by the Liberals. We all have our hands in this, so I can't stay here and say, oh my God, we were so virtuous that, you know, nothing we would do the same. I'll tell you one thing, I learned a very, very good lesson through this, but that's a whole other thing. But the point was, the opposition parties and the government forgot how to work together, because for years they didn't have to. For years, at the end of the NDP administration, during the Conservative administration, and then under the Liberal administration, they would go in and they would dictate at House Leaders meetings what was going to happen. Here, guys, here, girls, here's what's happening next week. Have a great day. Boom, that was the House Leaders meeting. Well, it was never that way before. And so when we fell into a minority parliament, everybody forgot how to work together, and we were somewhat with our backs up, all of us, and somewhat guarded, because everybody had lost that ability to do that, and those relationships that are so important to making this place work had disappeared. And where those relationships were done were on committee. Members spent time together. They listened to deputations together in different communities across Ontario. They would supper together afterwards. They would be on a bus or on a plane to wherever they were going. So you got to know each other. You got to know each other's families. And so it really changed the dynamic of how this place works. So no, I don't blame the government members for thinking, oh my God, imagine that. The opposition brought 400 amendments to the legislation. How terrible. I'm sorry, that's what committees are about. I've been at committees where Liberals in opposition to us and Tories in opposition to us and us in opposition to the Liberals and the Tories brought far more than 400 amendments. My God, I remember having a time in this House where we went there clause by clause with the Tories, and I don't remember how many amendments were, but we hadn't gone through a half of them, and it was 8.5 days later. But guess what? That's what this place is about. It's not about filibustering, but about giving the opportunity for legislation to be seen, to be heard, to be vetted, to get the public to have their say, which I'll talk about in a minute. And yes, gives the power a little bit to the opposition to be able to hold the government's feet to the fire. But here's the bottom line. It's a very brilliant system, the parliamentary system, because in the end, the government will always get its way. and rightfully so. The public of Ontario, do I like the results of the last election? God, no. I'm sure you do as Liberals. My good friends in the Conservative parties, I'm sure Steve doesn't like the results of the last election.
Not so much.
What's that?
They're 77% sadder today.
Okay, they're sadder today.
77%.
Okay, all right. But my point is the result of the election was decided by the people of Ontario. And once the public has spoken, that's it. We have to live with the result. And we lived by that in the opposition in the minority parliament. We said we need to respect the public for what they have done. They decided in minority parliament, and guess what? They've given the government a majority this time. I can't argue with that. I don't like it. But that's what it is. So I say to the government across the way, and I say to the Deputy Prime Minister or Premier, and I say to the government House Leader, you know, shame on you for bringing time allocation. I said it through the entire minority parliament. I will not be party to any time allocation. It never was. And sometimes we could have done that, and you know, as my whip, our whip, I see Madame Sherry DeNovo from Parkdale High Park, we would go into discussions with the Conservatives and the Liberals on some bills, and sometimes there were bills that we wanted. And the government would come up to me, my good friend Mr. John Malloy, I can call him by his first name now because he's not here. John would come to me and say, Gilles, this is an important bill for both of us. Let's time allocate. I'd say absolutely not. The Conservatives have a right to do what they're doing. If they want to speak this bill out, or they want to force it into committee by doing whatever, God bless, that is their right. So even in a position of power, our party recognized and respected the process that in the end the public is never wrong. And when they send us to this place, we need to respect them. And I think what time allocation does, it doesn't respect the public. Because here's now what's happening. Government does exactly what my good friend, the member from Leeds-Grenville, I'm so glad you sit here now. I'm going to learn that soon. It's going to be imprinted, my good buddy. So, as a member from Leeds-Grenville said, we went into House Leaders' meeting at the beginning of this session with the understanding, because the government sent a pretty direct message to both House Leaders and our teams, that in fact that they were prepared to give us some time in committee and prepared to give us some adequate time in debate if we were guaranteeing that they can get bills by a certain date. Now, they gave us a list of bills, and I'm not going to go through that, but both the Conservatives and New Democrats said, okay, we'll take that back to our folk. We understand you're going to get your bill in the end, and if we can find a way to give the public their say and for us to have our say in the House, that'd be a good thing. So we went out and did the work that we had to do. The government never intended to honour anything it had said. So I don't blame my good friend from Leeds-Grenville, the Tory House Leader, for being upset. We went through this whole process where the government understood Section 47 of the standing orders, and they had no intention of allowing us to have any kind of public hearings outside of Toronto. They had no intention of allowing proper vetting of the legislation by the public. And their game right from the beginning was to time allocate everything. And I'm not surprised by that, because I heard what the government had said at the beginning. But having been around this place for a while, I thought, no, these guys are going to time allocate. Because it is easier to time allocate than actually manage the situation and do it well. And that's the other lesson that I've learned over the years. The one thing human beings hate to do is manage and to make decisions. If you're a boss, easier to yell at somebody if they've done something wrong than to say, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. And let's try to find a way to not have that mistake happen again, or maybe it's an issue with me as the boss. That's why I like collective agreements. That's why I like unions, because they have a collective agreement and a grievance procedure. At least those workers who are organized have an ability to be heard. But the point is, nobody wants to manage. And what time allocation does is, it removes the government's responsibility to manage away from the legislature. So, like, I think we've all read our history. You know, the British parliamentary system was developed over 1,000 years for a couple of really basic principles. That we as a legislature never allow the executive, back in them days the king, but in our days the cabinet and the premier, the ability to spend money without the authorization of the legislature. That's our primary function. And even though that kind of happens, because of time allocation, the opposition, and I argue the public, because of it, has less scrutiny on the government expenses. The other thing that we're responsible for, obviously, is the legislative part of it. The government has the right to legislate bills in order to deal with different issues, as they are with this particular bill about transparency, which I'll get to in a second. And they have a right to do that. But here's the other kicker that drives me crazy. The legislature over the years, because we hate to manage, and we don't want any pesky MPPs getting in the way of actually dealing with legislation, we delegate the authority in the bill to regulation. And so now what happens, when I got here, for example, the Sustainable Forestry Development Act, most everything was defined in the legislation. It wasn't permitted by regulation for Cabinet to make this thing work other than the planning manuals, which is a whole other issue. But most bills that we pass through this House, we very, very seldom and very few examples will delegate our authority as a legislature to Cabinet. And I'm going to give you a good example where this has really served us badly. Agree or not agree, the Conservative government under Mr. Harris passed legislation that said you cannot do a referendum. You can only do a referendum if you want to do a casino in your community, you have to have a referendum, right? Because the NDP government of the day created three casinos, and the Tories of the day and the opposition were opposed to it. So when they got to government, they said, well, we'll fix that. You need to have a referendum. It was really clear what Mike Harris wanted. He wanted a referendum. So that legislation was passed, but they delegated the authority of the Act. The whole guts of the Act was delegated to Cabinet. Mr. McGuinty comes along. I can call him Mr. McGuinty now because he's no longer the Premier or member. Mr. McGuinty comes along, and what does he do? He basically, by regulation, says there won't be any referendum. Well, is that what the House pronounced itself on? When the House voted on that bill some years ago, did the House not say, no, there will be referendums? Absolutely. 50% plus one of the House said there has to be a referendum. But that decision was voided by the delegation of authority in the Act to the Cabinet, and the Cabinet of the day under Mr. McGuinty decided there will be no referendum. So when members in this House, and especially new members on the government side, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way. Listen, I was there, je me souviens, coming into this place as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young government member. Boy, I was going to change the world. It was a great, and I guess we had changed the world to a degree, but that's a whole other story. But we tend to believe what our whips and our House leaders and our Premier tells us and how great we are and why this is so important. Rah, rah, rah with the caucus. You're doing yourself a disservice, I can tell you. One of the things that we did as a government that I think was probably the worst mistake we did is that we introduced the concept of time allocation into our standing orders. And I was stupid enough, and I'm going to say it right here, to listen to my House leader and come in this House and give speeches on supporting that. And I remember an opposition member coming to see me by the name of Ernie Eves, who came to me after that, and he says, oh, you will rue the day that you gave that speech. And it wasn't too far after 1995 that I recognized what Mr. Eves had told me. And he was right. And that's why in opposition in a minority parliament, I and our caucus never supported time allocation, because it is a bad way of drafting legislation. So the government now, by way of this motion, is saying they're going to time allocate a transparency bill. Like, think about this for a second. It's a bill about transparency, and we're going to close the doors to the public and say we're not going to travel the bill outside of Toronto, and we're going to limit how much time there's going to be transparency in the committee process here at Queen's Park. It's a contradiction on every level. And the government members are going to say, oh yeah, but you brought 400 amendments, Steve. Oh, that was so terrible. Like, give me a break. There's rules. If you want to bring 2,000 amendments, bring them on. Right? And it may be a tactic by the opposition to slow you down. I'll admit that. It might have been. I don't know if it was, but it might be. But you know what? In the British parliamentary system, that's the process. That's the tools the opposition's given to do its job. And if you get held to account and somebody's holding your feet to the fire, you're far more likely to do better legislation. Let me ask you this question. Why is it that people don't speed on highways when they see a police officer going by? The fear of being caught. The only reason that people don't speed on highways is when they think they're going to be caught. And that's the same principle when it comes to legislation and time allocation and the right of the opposition to hold the government to account. If the government knows that it's going to be held to account by a strong opposition, if they know there's going to be clear transparency in a legislative process, guess what the legislation is going to look like? It'll be a heck of a lot better than what we're doing today. I see bills come through this House, and you guys did it under Conservatives, and the Liberals done it in spade and a whole bunch of other bills, where they bring really good ideas forward. They draft a flawed bill. They agree it's flawed when you get the clause by clause, but the minister and the bureaucracy says, no, don't change it because we'll look politically weak if we change the bill. I'll give you another one. You remember Linda Jeffries? I can say her name because she's no longer a member either. Her worship, Linda Jeffries, was Minister of Natural Resources. And there was a section in the Far North Planning Act, and I don't remember the details, but that section of the Far North Planning Act, I'm going to sort of, make it a little bit up because I don't remember the details, said the sky shall be blue. And so, see there, like I normally do. Okay, all right, that's fine. You don't get the gist of this whatsoever then. Just keep on doing what you're doing. No, just stay in your world and don't come out again for at least another 10, 15 minutes. So my point is this. Well, if you listen to what he heckled, I don't mind being heckled. You guys can heckle me all you want, but that was just, he missed the whole gist of what the speech is about. So Linda Jeffries, who was a very, well-meaning Minister of the Crown, brings forward a bill with good intention of creating a planning mechanism in the far north. Now, you may be opposed to that. You may be in favor of it. It's irrelevant. The bill came forward. And there was a section of the bill that said the sky shall be blue. And I remember reading the act and sitting in committee, and I go, geez, that doesn't mean blue. That means black. It means the sky is going to be black. So I raised the point through committee. I asked a couple of people who came to depute to the committee, tell me what your interpretation of that section is. And they would say each and every time, it's completely opposite to what the government intends. So when we got the clause by clause, we proposed amendments to fix it. I didn't like her bill. In fact, I voted against it. But I was at least trying to make it better, so I proposed an amendment. The government was refusing the amendment, so I says, okay, I want to ask legal counsel on committee, give me an explanation of what that part of the bill says. They said, in fact, it's not blue, it's black. And the government members were saying, no, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm sorry. These are legislative lawyers hired by the committee that are nonpartisan who are there to assist the committee. So I said, okay, fine. Let me call the ministry lawyer up. And I remember, I think it was Diane Corbett, who was the ADM who was on committee at the time, who came before it. I may have this wrong. Maybe it wasn't Diane, but it seems to me it was Diane Corbett. And there was a lawyer for the ministry who came forward, and I asked the question, tell me what the meaning of that section is, and am I wrong? Is this not what I say it is? And they said, no, you're right. In fact, you're 100% right. Because they couldn't lie to committee. They understand as civil servants, if you come before a committee and you knowingly lie, you can be held in contempt. It's like going to court and lying to the judge. We have the kin powers to a judge and a court. So I talked to Linda Jeffries, and she goes, Gilles, thanks for that. Let me talk to the corner office over there. Remember Mr. McGinty? And I'll get back to you tomorrow. She came back to me, and I'm not going to reveal what she said to me in that conversation because it was said privately. But I can tell you the bill was not amended. So even when the government knew its own bill was flawed, they didn't amend it because they didn't have to. It was easier for them to leave it flawed than to make the change. So what I'm trying to implore here to government members, when you go to your caucus meeting tomorrow, I think you need to have a discussion about where you use time allocation, and that you should actually do what the Premier and the House Leader attempted to, what they were trying to tell us at the beginning of this Parliament, to find the ways to work together. And guess what? You're going to find the opposition is not going to hold everything up. It's quite the opposite. Because of time allocation, the only thing we can now do is talk everything up for 6.5 hours and have 2 hours of debate and time allocation. So of course we're going to debate. And we're going to use all the time we can at third reading. Do you remember third reading back in the days before time allocation, clerk? There was no such thing. The bill would get called for third reading and nobody get up to debate because it'd be an agreement. Now we talk everything out at third reading. Time allocation doesn't help to get your agenda forward. It just creates flawed legislation and frustrates the process. And I'll argue, you will find that if the House Leader had been serious about what he was proposing, and he had to understand if he put forward, was it 6 bills, Steve? I think it was 6.
It started as 4, then 5.
Yeah. So it kept on going. It's 7. But if the government would have come to us and said, "Here's 7, and this is what we want," we may not have agreed to the 7. We may not have given you fast passage on all 7. We might have given you fast passage on 4 or 5. The Conservatives might have said, this bill, we're really, something that we're interested in and we want to have some hearings, and you Democrats probably would have said the same thing. And yeah, guess what? You may have had to travel a couple of bills. Guess what? The member from Ottawa South and I might have been on committee somewhere in Ontario in the intercession in February or January. We might have got to know each other a little bit better. We may have been able to engage stakeholders on the bill at hand. We might have even agreed on some amendments to make the bill better. I may still vote against your bill, but it's in my interest to make it better. I've never known a member of the opposition, no matter what side of the House I'm on, who goes in and decides that they're going to try to make the bill worse. The way our expression is voting yea or nay. Our job as legislators is to try to make the bill work. So I encourage you, go to your caucus meeting, if not tomorrow, next week, and have a discussion with your House Leader and your Premier about really trying to find a way not to use time allocation, because you are not serving your own interest by doing so. I'll tell you, every time you use time allocation, we will speak 6.5 hours to every bill. We will speak 2 hours to every time allocation motion, and we will speak as long as we can at third reading. And yes, we might even ring bells. Who knows? I'm not big on that. Steve and I are not bell ringers, I always thought. But I'm just saying, it's the only tools you got. But if you actually did what this legislature used to do years ago and you didn't use time allocation, you might find, if you tried that, you would find a much different result in this place. And you probably find members are probably more willing to work together than you think it is. So I spoke on delegated authority, so I don't have to say anything else, but I urge you to have that discussion. And who knows, maybe one day discussion will be had in this legislature about how we can actually do what we're sent here to do, and that is to give bills proper scrutiny, to allow the government to get it in the end, but in the meantime to give it the proper scrutiny so that bills get what it is that they need to make them actually work in the end. Merci.